Story 1.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a few friends, a cabin in the mountains, and a heavy snowstorm. By the time they arrived, the roads had turned to ice, and the visibility was almost zero. The storm was relentless, trapping them in the cabin with no way out. The wind howled outside, but inside, everything seemed eerily quiet. They set up a fire, cracked open some drinks, and tried to make the best of it. But there was something unsettling about the silence. They'd been in the cabin for hours, yet no one had heard a single sound from outside. As the night wore on, a sense of unease began to settle in. One of them, Jack, stepped outside for a moment to check the storm. He came back pale, his breath shallow. "There are footprints in the snow," he said, his voice trembling. The others laughed it off, thinking it was just the storm playing tricks on his mind. But as the hours passed, the strange feeling grew stronger. Every now and then, someone would glance out of the window, only to see nothing but the thick, swirling snow. Yet, those footsteps, they seemed to be getting closer. At first, they ignored it, just an oddity in the storm, they thought. But by the time it was nearing midnight, the strange footprints appeared again, this time right up to the door. Jack's pulse quickened. He swore the prints hadn't been there before. He'd looked outside, and the snow was undisturbed. Everyone else was starting to get nervous too. It wasn't just the footprints anymore, there was something else. A coldness in the air, a strange pressure that seemed to press in from all sides. The fire crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Sarah, one of the friends, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's just some wildlife," she suggested. But her voice faltered as she looked out the window. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered. That's when they all saw it. A shadowy figure moving slowly through the snow. But there was something wrong with the way it moved, unnatural, jerky, like it was dragging something behind it. The figure stopped right in front of the cabin for a moment, then disappeared into the storm. Everyone held their breath. No one moved for what felt like hours. As the night stretched on, things only got worse. They all gathered around the fire, but no one could shake the feeling of being watched. Sarah, who had always been the most skeptical, finally couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going outside," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to know what's going on." She grabbed her jacket and left before anyone could stop her. Minutes later, there was a scream. It wasn't long, just a few seconds, but it was enough. It sounded like Sarah, but it was distorted, like the wind itself had grabbed her voice and twisted it into something unrecognizable. The others rushed to the door, but when they stepped outside, Sarah was gone. The footprints led into the snow, deeper and deeper into the storm, but there was no sign of her. Nothing but an endless sea of white. The storm raged on, but now, the group knew something was terribly wrong. They locked the doors and barricaded the windows, but every time they looked outside, they could see those strange footprints, now surrounding the house. The wind howled, and the temperature seemed to plummet further. They huddled together in silence, too afraid to speak, until Jack broke the silence. "It's a demon," he said, his face as pale as death. "A snow demon. I've heard stories about them. It's the only thing that makes sense." He described the creature, tall, covered in snow, its body formed of frost and ice. It stalks its prey through blizzards, leading them deeper into the storm until they freeze to death or are taken by the creature. The more the group stayed inside, the closer the demon would get. They weren't just trapped by the snowstorm, they were trapped by the demon, and it wasn't leaving. Panic began to spread. The fear was palpable now, and with every passing hour, the sense of dread grew stronger. They tried to sleep, but the presence in the house was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the snow. It wasn't just the footprints outside. It was something else, something watching them from within the storm, its icy fingers creeping into the warmth of the cabin. Then, just as dawn approached, they heard it, a scraping sound coming from the roof. It sounded like claws dragging across the wood. Sarah's scream echoed in their minds. The shadow outside moved again, this time closer, almost to the door. The group huddled in the corner, eyes wide with terror. The scraping sound stopped, and for a moment, everything went eerily silent. But then the door burst open with a deafening crack, and there stood the creature. Its eyes were hollow, its face frozen in a permanent snarl, and its body was a mass of shifting, snow-covered limbs. The demon had come for them. There was no escape. As it advanced, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted. The air grew thick with frost, and the walls seemed to close in. Jack was the first to make a run for it, but as soon as he stepped outside, he vanished into the storm. The others didn't wait long. One by one, they ran, but none of them could outrun the demon. The snow swirled around them like a blinding vortex, and the cold was suffocating. They never made it far, each of them taken by the demon, their screams swallowed by the storm. By morning, the cabin stood silent. The snow had stopped falling, and the storm had passed, but the demon remained. The footprints outside were gone, and the house stood undisturbed. But deep in the snow, there were more footprints, leading into the mountains. No one would ever find them. The demon had claimed them all. Days passed, and a search team was sent to find the missing group. They arrived at the cabin, but there was nothing left. The doors were locked, the windows boarded up. It was as if no one had ever been there at all. But then one of the searchers stepped outside and froze. He looked down at his boots, and there they were, footprints in the snow, leading from the house and into the mountains. They weren't human. The team hesitated, but curiosity got the better of them. They followed the trail. Hours later, they found the first body. It was frozen solid, its face contorted in fear. But the strangest thing? The body wasn't alone. It was surrounded by dozens of footprints, as if something had been circling it. As they continued deeper into the mountains, they began to realize that the demon hadn't left. It had only waited. And now, it was hunting again.
Story 2.
The town of Frostwood was frozen in time, locked under a thick layer of ice that never seemed to melt. The streets were empty, houses abandoned, and the only sound that echoed through the frigid air was the howl of the wind. It wasn't always like this. There used to be life here, people would gather at the tavern, children would play in the snow. But that was before the disappearances started. One by one, people began vanishing without a trace. No one knew where they went. The snow would fall, and the town would grow quieter, colder. It was as though the life itself was being sucked out of Frostwood. James had lived in Frostwood his whole life, but he could feel the chill in the air wasn't just from the winter. Something was wrong. The stories had been told for generations, warnings passed down from those who still remembered the old ways. The locals spoke of a curse that claimed those who froze to death, turning them into something else. Ghosts, but not just any ghosts. These were the ice spirits, frozen entities that roamed the earth, seeking out the living to replace themselves. The legend said that anyone who died in Frostwood by the cold wouldn't rest until they found a new soul to steal. James couldn't shake the feeling that the disappearances were connected to this legend. His childhood friend, Emma, was the most recent to vanish, and her disappearance hit him hard. He needed answers. Something told him that he was next unless he figured out what was going on. So, in the dead of night, he grabbed his jacket, packed his gear, and set out to investigate the truth behind the disappearances. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew one thing: the answers were out there, somewhere in the frozen town. James began his search in the heart of Frostwood, the old church at the edge of town. It was a place that had always made him uneasy. The stained glass windows were shattered, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something else, something ancient. He scanned the walls, searching for any signs that might give him a clue, when he found it, a journal, tucked away behind the pulpit. Its pages were brittle with age, but the words were still legible. The journal belonged to the town's former priest, Father Malcolm. The entries described a horrifying event, a winter so cold, so severe, that people began dying from the cold faster than they could bury them. But then something strange happened. Those who died didn't stay dead. The priest wrote about hearing their voices at night, seeing figures moving through the snow, covered in frost. He believed the souls of the dead were being trapped in the ice, forced to remain in the town, unable to move on. Desperate, he had tried to perform an exorcism, but he had failed. The curse, as it seemed, could not be broken. James shivered as he read the final entry. The priest had written that the ice spirits were not just seeking warmth, they were seeking a body to inhabit, to replace the one they had lost. They couldn't die, not truly. They could only freeze, and in their frozen state, they would search for a new life to take. The realization hit James like a ton of bricks. Emma wasn't gone. She had been taken, and now, she was one of them. Determined to stop whatever was happening, James ventured deeper into the heart of Frostwood, past the church and into the outskirts of town. The snow was deeper here, and the silence felt oppressive, like the town itself was holding its breath. He couldn't explain why, but he felt eyes on him, as if something was watching, waiting. The wind howled as he passed the old mill, the broken windows and cracked walls making it look like a place lost to time. But then, he saw something in the distance, a figure standing motionless in the snow. James froze. He wasn't sure what he was seeing, but the shape in the distance was unmistakable. It was a person, but they were standing still in the middle of a blizzard, as though they were frozen in time. His heart raced as he cautiously approached, but as he drew closer, the figure began to turn. The face was obscured by layers of frost, but he could still make out the hollow eyes staring back at him. The figure began to move toward him, its limbs stiff and jerky. It was one of them, an ice spirit. Without thinking, James ran. The creature pursued him, its cold breath freezing the very air around him. He could hear its movements growing faster, the sound of its frozen body dragging across the snow. He stumbled and fell, feeling the cold creep into his bones. The ice spirit was getting closer. He could feel the weight of its presence, as if it were closing in from all sides, suffocating him with its cold. James managed to escape the spirit, barely making it back to his home. His breath was ragged as he slammed the door behind him, locking it quickly. He leaned against it, gasping for air, the cold from the spirit still clinging to his skin. His mind raced. What had he just seen? The ice spirit, it was real. And Emma, she had been one of them. But how was he supposed to stop it? How could he break a curse so old, so powerful? That night, as James sat in his house, staring out at the endless snow, he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps in the snow outside. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he realized it was rhythmic, slow, deliberate. Someone was outside, walking toward his house. He held his breath and peered through the window. The figure he saw was unmistakable. It was Emma, her face pale, her body covered in frost, just like the other spirits. "James." Her voice was cold, distorted, as if it were carried on a gust of wind. "Come outside, it's time." James could barely comprehend what he was hearing. It was Emma, but it wasn't her. The eyes staring back at him were empty, hollow, filled with nothing but the cold void. He backed away from the window, heart racing. The legend was true. Emma had come back to claim him. The next day, James knew what he had to do. He couldn't outrun the spirits, and he couldn't fight them. They were not of this world, not anymore. The only way to stop them was to destroy the source of the curse, to break the cycle. He returned to the church, searching through the priest's journals for any clue that might help him. Finally, buried deep in the pages, he found it, a ritual, an old incantation that might reverse the curse, but it required one thing: sacrifice. James knew what he had to do. He had to give himself up to the spirits, to become the new vessel for their cursed existence. It was the only way to break the cycle, to save the town from the horrors that had been lurking in the snow. He prepared himself, the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. The town had suffered long enough. He could end it, but at the cost of his own soul. That night, he stood in front of the frozen lake, the ritual complete. He could feel the spirits closing in, their cold touch already creeping up his spine. He closed his eyes and whispered the incantation. The ground beneath him trembled, and the ice cracked. He knew what was coming. But when the spirits reached him, he wasn't prepared for the overwhelming cold that filled him. It was as if the very essence of the curse had consumed him. When James woke up, everything was silent. The wind had stopped, the snow had ceased, and for the first time in years, Frostwood felt warm. But as he looked around, he saw it, the ice had melted. The town was free. The curse had been lifted, but there was no sign of the spirits. He walked through the streets, searching for any trace of life. But the town was empty. He was the last one left. As he walked toward the town square, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A figure standing by the church. It was Emma, her face still frozen, still filled with that same hollow emptiness. She looked at him with vacant eyes and smiled. It was then that he realized the terrible truth: he hadn't broken the curse. He had become part of it. The spirits hadn't disappeared. They had simply moved on to the next victim. And now, it was his turn to find a replacement. Weeks passed, and Frostwood remained silent, its streets empty. The townspeople had all vanished, taken by the ice spirits. But every now and then, someone passing through the mountains would hear whispers in the wind, a voice calling them into the snow. And if they listened too closely, they might catch a glimpse of a figure standing motionless in the blizzard, waiting for its next victim. The curse of Frostwood would never end. It would only grow, waiting for the next soul to claim. And somewhere, in the heart of the town, James walked, searching for a new replacement, a new soul to fill the void.
Story 2.
It was supposed to be a simple family Christmas getaway, just like every other year. The Martins, a family of 5, packed up the car, loaded with gifts and food, and set off for the old family house in the countryside. The house was a relic from a different time, cold and mysterious, but to them, it held nostalgia, warmth, and fond memories. The snow-covered path leading up to it always gave the place a magical touch. When they arrived, something felt off. The usual creak of the wooden floor was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. As they walked toward the front door, a strange sight stopped them in their tracks. There, at the doorstep, was a large, intricately carved ice cross, gleaming in the moonlight. Its sharp edges reflected a strange, unnatural glow. It wasn't there the last time they visited, and none of them could figure out who had placed it there. "That's odd," Sarah, the mother, said, eyeing the cross with unease. "Who would leave something like that here?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she shook it off. It was just a Christmas decoration, right? But deep down, she had a feeling that the cross wasn't as innocent as it appeared. The family stood there, hesitant, before finally deciding to step over it and enter the house. As the night drew on, the family gathered around the fire, unpacking gifts and enjoying a warm meal. Despite the unease they all felt, they tried to make the best of it. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Every now and then, she'd catch a glimpse of movement at the corner of her eye, but when she turned, nothing was there. It wasn't until they all went to bed that things started to take a darker turn. In the dead of night, a sudden bang echoed through the house, followed by what sounded like a distant whispering. The family woke in a panic, their hearts racing. The wind outside was strong, but the noises they heard didn't seem to come from the storm. It felt like something was moving inside the house, something sinister. When they checked the living room, the ice cross was gone. At first, they assumed someone had moved it, but Sarah's heart sank when she saw the snow outside. There were no footprints leading away from the house. It was as though the cross had simply vanished into thin air. The air grew colder, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. The family tried to laugh it off, but the uneasy feeling never left. The next day, as Sarah was cleaning the house, she stumbled across an old journal, buried beneath the floorboards in the attic. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. The journal told the story of the original owner of the house, a man named Elias Martin. He had been obsessed with dark rituals, attempting to summon something beyond human understanding. One fateful winter, he had crafted an ice cross to seal his pact with whatever he had called forth. The journal went on to explain that the cross was no mere decoration, it was a curse. Anyone who saw the cross, or touched it, would be marked for death. The curse would slowly consume the souls of those who came too close, pulling them into a darkness they could never escape. The family was horrified. The cross was not just a trinket, it was a vessel of pure malevolence. As Sarah read the journal aloud to the family, they began to understand the gravity of their situation. It was clear that they had unleashed something by stepping over the cursed cross. But how could they escape it now? The night was closing in, and they knew they would have to face whatever this curse had in store for them. That night, the house felt alive with whispers and shifting shadows. It was as if the walls were closing in on them. The temperature dropped so low that their breath formed clouds in the air. But the worst part was the sound of something scratching at the windows, the sound of something trying to get in. At around midnight, one of the children, young Emily, woke up screaming. She had seen something outside her window, something that shouldn't have been there. Her parents rushed to her side, but when they opened the door, they found nothing. Emily swore that she saw a figure, tall and cloaked in shadows, standing by the edge of the forest. The next morning, Emily was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no sign that she had even left the room. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The family was beside themselves with grief, but there was no time to mourn. The curse had already begun its work. As the sun set, they knew it was only a matter of time before the darkness would claim another. The remaining members of the family, now consumed by fear, huddled together, trying to stay awake and keep each other safe. But the house seemed to have a life of its own, groaning and creaking in unnatural ways. Every time they tried to leave, the door would slam shut as though something invisible was holding them inside. It was Sarah who broke first. One night, after hearing a distant voice calling her name, she ventured into the cold, empty halls of the house. The whispers seemed to be everywhere, each one pulling her deeper into madness. The figure that had claimed Emily's life was now calling her. The house was alive with its hunger, and Sarah could feel herself slipping away with every step she took. She reached the spot where the cross had once been, and the air grew heavy. A cold wind howled through the walls, and Sarah felt something cold and sharp pierce her skin. She screamed, but no sound came out. The curse had marked her, and there was no escape now. The darkness wrapped around her, pulling her into the void. The remaining family members, David and his 2 sons, were now desperate. They had seen the horrors that had claimed their loved ones. Each night, the house seemed to grow more oppressive, the shadows longer, the whispers louder. They could feel it closing in on them, consuming them bit by bit. They tried to break the curse, following every clue in the journal. They performed rituals, burned offerings, and even tried to destroy the house itself. But nothing worked. The curse was stronger than anything they could comprehend. Every attempt to break free only seemed to make it angrier. By the time they realized there was no way out, it was too late. One by one, the curse picked them off. David, his sons, none of them survived. They vanished into the night, leaving behind only their screams, lost to the ice cross's insatiable hunger. The house stood silent, as if nothing had ever happened, waiting for the next family to step through its doors. Years later, the house remained abandoned, the snow still falling around it, untouched by time. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning those who ventured too close. But no one ever came. The house had claimed too many lives, and the curse was too strong to break. The ice cross still lay there, waiting for the next family to arrive. The Martins were forgotten, their names lost to history. But the curse remained. It would never stop, never release its hold. The house stood as a warning to all who dared to approach. And in the cold silence of the night, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint whispers of the Martins, still trapped, still waiting for an escape that would never come.
Story 4.
It was one of those weekends when everyone needed a break from city life. The snow was slowly beginning to melt, but there was still a thick blanket covering the ground. So, a group of 5 friends decided to head to an old summer house by a frozen river. The house had been in one of their families for generations, but it had been abandoned for years. It was isolated, quiet, and perfect for escaping the busy world. When they arrived, the house seemed almost too quiet. The windows were covered in grime, and the door creaked loudly as they pushed it open. Despite its age, the place felt solid enough, though there was something unsettling about the silence. They shrugged it off, blaming the isolation, and started settling in for the night. The wind howled outside, but they laughed it off, cranking up the fireplace and getting ready for a cozy evening. Later, as the night grew darker, the snow outside intensified. The crackling of the fire was the only sound inside the house. But soon, another noise cut through, the unmistakable sound of something scraping beneath the floor. At first, they assumed it was just the house settling, but then it came again, louder this time. A low, rhythmic thudding sound, as if something was moving underneath them, under the ice. As the group of friends sat in the living room, unease began to grow. Sarah, one of the friends, went to the window and stared out at the frozen river. The ice stretched out like a vast, lifeless expanse. The noise came again. This time, it was almost like a deep, muffled growl, coming from somewhere beneath the ice. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly turned away, not wanting to look. "Did you hear that?" she asked, voice trembling. The others paused, and for a moment, all that could be heard was the wind and the crackling fire. "What's going on?" Mark, one of the friends, asked, clearly unsettled. "Maybe it's just an animal trapped under the ice," he suggested. But Sarah wasn't convinced. There was something different about this sound, something almost unnatural about it. They decided to investigate. The group bundled up and walked down to the edge of the river. The moonlight made the ice shimmer, and everything looked calm. But as they stood there, they realized the noise wasn't coming from above, it was coming from below. Something was beneath the ice, something big, something old, and something hungry. They turned back to the house in silence, not speaking a word to each other. Whatever it was, they were not ready to face it just yet. The night dragged on, and the strange sounds continued. Each time the noise seemed to get closer, more insistent. The group huddled around the fire, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up on them. But as the hours passed, it became harder to ignore. The scratching, the thudding, the muffled growls, each sound sending a chill down their spines. Around midnight, Mark couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a flashlight and insisted on going out to investigate. The others were hesitant, but they followed him down to the riverbank, the cold air biting at their skin. They stood in front of the ice, listening. The sound was louder now, almost as if something was trying to break through from below. Mark knelt down and shined the flashlight onto the ice. That's when they saw it, an enormous crack running through the river, wide enough to swallow a person whole. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, stepping back in fear. The crack seemed to pulse, almost like it was alive, as if whatever was beneath the ice was trying to break free. Mark pressed his hand to the ice, feeling its unnatural coldness, and then he froze. A shadow moved beneath the surface, long and twisted. Something was coming, something ancient, and it wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. Panic set in. They didn't know what they were dealing with, but they could feel its presence. The ice beneath them began to crack further, the surface bulging unnaturally. The growl beneath them grew louder, more frantic. Something ancient, something evil, was awakening from its slumber. Mark, his face pale with terror, backed away from the river, urging everyone to get inside the house. As they ran back to the house, the sound intensified. It was no longer just a thud or a scrape, it was a deep, violent roar that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. They slammed the door shut and locked it behind them, but it felt like it didn't matter. Whatever was under the ice had awoken, and it wasn't going to be stopped. The house grew colder, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. It was as if the house itself was afraid of what was coming. Inside, they tried to rationalize it, but deep down, they knew they couldn't escape. The ancient evil that lay beneath the frozen river was awake now, and it was coming for them. They had disturbed something that should have been left undisturbed. The sounds grew louder, more frantic, as if something was pounding against the ice from below, desperate to break free. As the night dragged on, the group became more and more paranoid. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside seemed like a threat. They tried to barricade the windows, but the noises from the river were growing too loud. It felt like something was moving under the house, something powerful and relentless. Every time they thought they heard a knock on the door, it turned out to be nothing, but the fear remained, gnawing at them, growing stronger. And then the ice cracked. A deafening sound, like thunder, echoed through the night. The house seemed to shake with it. They ran to the windows, peering out into the dark night. The river was no longer still, the ice had split open, and something dark and shadowy was emerging from the depths. It moved slowly, like a beast stirring from a long, deep slumber. They could barely make out the shape, tall, twisted, with limbs too long and unnatural. It was huge, with black, glistening eyes that reflected nothing but malice. The ground trembled as it rose, towering over the frozen river. It was coming for them, its growl shaking the very air. There was no escape now. They had disturbed it, and now they would pay the price. The group barricaded themselves in the house, but they knew it wouldn't be enough. The monster was getting closer, its growls louder with every passing minute. They tried to call for help, but their phones were useless, the signals dead. The only thing that remained was the overwhelming feeling of dread, as though death was standing just outside the door, waiting. One by one, they began to disappear. First, Sarah. Then Mark. Then Tom. Each time, there was a scream, and then silence. The others tried to run, but it was too late. The creature moved faster than they could comprehend, its long limbs reaching into the house, pulling them into the dark. No matter how far they ran, the ice had already claimed them. By dawn, there was nothing left. The house stood still, abandoned once again. The river, now completely unfrozen, lay quiet and undisturbed. The evil that had risen from beneath the ice had returned to its slumber, and the silence returned, except for the faint echo of growls, waiting for the next group to disturb its resting place. Years passed, and the house remained empty, the memory of the terrible night fading into whispers among the few who dared to speak of it. But every winter, when the ice would begin to form again, people would disappear. The few who knew the story would warn others, but no one ever listened. The creature beneath the ice, ancient and hungry, was patient. It would wait, and when the snow fell and the ice thickened once more, it would rise again. One winter, another group of friends made the same trip, unaware of the fate that awaited them. The house stood silent, the ice stretched out over the river, and the creature, once again, was waking. And so, the cycle would continue. The monster beneath the ice would never stop, never rest. It would keep claiming souls until the end of time.
Story 5.
It was a bitterly cold winter night when I found myself desperately seeking shelter from the snowstorm. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. I had been walking for hours, and exhaustion was starting to take its toll. That's when I saw the faint outline of a village through the blizzard. It looked abandoned, but it was my only chance for warmth. I stumbled towards it, relief flooding over me. The village was eerily quiet, not a single soul in sight. The houses were in varying states of decay, their windows shattered and doors hanging off their hinges. It was as though time had forgotten this place. But something about it felt wrong. There was no movement, no sound other than the wind. I entered the closest house, which still had a roof, hoping to find some shelter. The fireplace was cold, the air damp and musty, but it was better than nothing. I settled down by the window, watching the storm rage outside, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. That night, as the storm raged on, I began to hear strange whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, howling and shifting through the cracks in the walls. But no, these were voices, faint but distinct. They seemed to come from all directions, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The whispers grew louder the following night. It was as if the village itself was alive, each house echoing with the voices of the long dead. At first, I convinced myself I was just hearing things, that it was the wind or the eerie stillness of the place playing with my mind. But then, the whispers seemed to take shape, words, names, desperate pleas. They didn't make sense, yet I could feel the fear in them, a primal terror that gripped my chest. The voices came from every direction, and it felt like they were closing in on me. I tried to leave the house, but the snow had piled up too high, blocking the door. I pounded on the walls, shouting into the void, but no one answered. The cold was unbearable, and I had no choice but to stay inside, my heart racing in terror. The whispers seemed to mock me now, the voices speaking louder, more insistent, calling my name. I couldn't understand what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure: this village wasn't empty. There was something here, something ancient, waiting. Something that had been waiting for a long time. I couldn't stay here any longer, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't leave. The village had become a prison, and the voices, the whispers, they were everywhere, following me. On the third night, I ventured into the heart of the village, determined to uncover its secrets. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold was still biting. I walked past the crumbling houses, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling in my gut. That's when I came across the old church, its door hanging open, creaking in the wind. I couldn't resist. I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. Inside, the church was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon through the broken stained glass. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the altar, covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. The whispers were louder here, more urgent, like the voices were trying to tell me something. I approached the altar, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it, a book, old and worn, lying open on the altar. It was filled with pages written in that same language from the whispers. As I flipped through the pages, I learned the horrifying truth. This village had once been home to people who had practiced an ancient ritual, one that involved the sacrifice of souls to an old god of winter. The ritual was meant to keep the village safe from the harshest winters, but at a terrible cost. The souls of those sacrificed never truly left. They were trapped in the village, doomed to wander in eternal torment. Their whispers were the last remnants of their humanity, forever searching for release. I spent the next few days in a daze, unable to escape the village. The whispers had become unbearable, filling every corner of my mind. I tried to leave, but every path I took led me back to the same spot, the village square, the church. It was as if the place itself was alive, pulling me back into its dark embrace. The more I learned about the ritual, the more I realized that I wasn't just a visitor, I was part of the curse now. The voices began to call out to me, growing more desperate, more frantic. I could hear the sorrow and regret in their tones, the lost souls reaching out to me. They wanted something from me. They wanted me to join them, to become part of their endless suffering. Every time I tried to sleep, I could feel their cold fingers brushing against me, their breath on the back of my neck. The whispers were no longer just voices, they were faces, emerging from the shadows, pale and hollow-eyed. They reached out to me with bony fingers, their mouths moving soundlessly, begging for help. But I knew the truth now. There was no escape. The curse was real, and I had been caught in its grasp. Each night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They no longer spoke in a language I didn't understand. They were speaking directly to me now, calling me by name. The faces in the shadows were always there, their eyes following my every movement. They were waiting for me to make the choice, to decide if I would join them or become the next victim of the curse. I tried to leave once more, running through the snow-covered streets, desperate to escape. But the village was always there, always pulling me back. The snowstorm had returned, and this time, it was worse than before. The wind howled like the voices of the damned, and the snow seemed to have a mind of its own, closing in around me, trapping me in a labyrinth of frozen streets. I stumbled into the church again, and that's when I realized the horrifying truth. There was no way out. The ritual had been completed long ago. I was part of it now. The voices were my companions, the faces were my future. I was to become another lost soul, forever wandering in the eternal winter night. The voices grew stronger, now begging for my soul. They told me that I could join them, that I could escape the cold and the torment if I accepted their offer. The choice was mine, they said. I could live, but only if I took part in the ritual. Only if I became one of them. As the cold crept into my bones and my mind began to unravel, I realized there was no way to fight it. I could feel the pull, the icy fingers of the dead reaching out to me, beckoning me into the darkness. I wasn't sure what would happen if I refused. Maybe they would drag me into the snow, never to be seen again. Or maybe they would just leave me in the village, forever trapped in the cold, hearing their whispers but never being able to join them. I hesitated, my breath shallow and ragged. The choice was impossible. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't run anymore. I had been part of this place from the beginning. And so, I made my decision. I became one of them. I don't know how it happened, but I felt my body grow cold, my senses fading. The whispers surrounded me, their voices a twisted melody in my ears. I looked down at my hands, pale, lifeless, the skin starting to rot. I was no longer human. I was a part of the curse, a part of the village, a part of the eternal winter night. Now, I wander the streets of that forsaken place, waiting for the next traveler to come. I whisper to them in the dark, hoping they'll hear me. Hoping they'll make the same choice I did. I am one of the lost souls now, trapped in this frozen hell, doomed to walk in the shadows for eternity. And when the next snowstorm comes, I will be there, calling out to the next lost soul, waiting to pull them into the curse, just as I was pulled in.
Story 6.
It was a cold winter evening when I received the gift. A small, elegantly wrapped box sat on my doorstep, its corners slightly worn, as though it had traveled far. Inside, there was an antique mirror, its frame intricately carved with delicate snowflakes that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. It felt old, ancient even, as if it held secrets I wasn't meant to know. I wasn't sure who had sent it, but there was something about it that fascinated me. Something about the way the crystals glistened, making the mirror almost alive. I placed it on my desk in the corner of the room, and for the first few days, it was just a mirror, nothing more. I didn't think much of it, though every now and then, I would catch myself staring at it longer than usual, as if waiting for something to happen. The first snow of the season fell soon after, and that's when the strange events began. The mirror started to change. It was subtle at first, my reflection seemed off, like it wasn't quite me. But when I looked again, everything seemed normal. I thought it was just the way the light hit it, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The next time the snow fell, it happened again. But this time, it wasn't just my reflection. As I gazed into the glass, the room around me seemed to distort, twisting and darkening as if I were looking through a fog. And then, I saw it, a figure in the reflection, standing just behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. It was as if the mirror was showing me a glimpse of something beyond the present. Something from the past, days past, and every time the snow fell, the visions in the mirror grew clearer. At first, I thought it was just my imagination running wild. The mirror had always been strange, but this was something different. The figures I saw were not just random images, they were faces, people from the past. Some I recognized from old photographs in my family album. Others were unfamiliar, their eyes full of sorrow, as if they were trying to tell me something. One night, while sitting in front of the mirror, I saw a woman, her face twisted in agony. She was standing in what looked like an old house, surrounded by a thick, swirling fog. I reached out to touch the glass, but as my fingers brushed against it, I felt a coldness seep into my skin, an icy chill that went straight to my bones. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I could have sworn she was staring into my soul. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear her words, just a faint, distant whisper that seemed to echo inside my head. The next day, I did some research on the mirror, hoping to find some explanation. What I discovered sent a chill down my spine. The mirror wasn't just an antique, it was a relic, crafted long ago by a man obsessed with time. It was said to have the power to freeze time, to capture moments in a way that no other object could. But there was a catch. The mirror didn't just freeze time, it trapped those moments, those people, inside it. And every time the snow fell, those trapped souls would awaken, desperate to break free. It wasn't long before I started to notice the change in myself. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting feeling of déjà vu, a sense that time was slipping through my fingers. But then it grew worse. I would wake up and find that hours had passed, but I couldn't remember what I had done. I would go to bed and wake up in the same position, as if time had simply stopped for me. I was caught in a loop, and the more I used the mirror, the more I realized the truth. It had the power to stop time, but at a terrible cost. One evening, as the snow fell heavier than ever, I stood before the mirror once more. This time, the figure in the reflection wasn't just a figure. It was a man, his face twisted in pain, his eyes pleading with me. He raised his hand, as though begging for help. But I knew now, he wasn't asking for help. He was warning me. The more I stared, the more I could feel myself slipping away. I wasn't just watching the past anymore, I was becoming part of it. The mirror had started to consume me, trapping me in its endless loop of time. I tried to pull away, but it was as if the mirror had a hold on me, drawing me deeper into its grasp. I could feel the cold seep into my very soul, freezing me from the inside out. The snow outside seemed to grow louder, the howling wind a reminder of the price I would pay. The people I had seen in the mirror, were they trapped because of the same mistake? Had they, too, thought they could control time? Had they, like me, paid the price for their curiosity? The more I thought about the curse, the more I realized there was no way out. The mirror had already claimed so much of me. The faces in the glass grew clearer, their eyes more desperate with each passing day. And then, one night, the mirror showed me something I couldn't ignore. I saw myself, my own face twisted in agony, my eyes wide with terror. I was trapped in the same eternal moment, forever frozen, unable to escape. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. There was no going back. I had made a terrible mistake. The mirror was never just a simple reflection. It was a prison. And I had unknowingly become its warden. Every time I stared into its depths, I was inviting more souls into my world, souls that would never find peace. But it didn't matter. The mirror had me now. The more I tried to pull away, the more it consumed me. I could hear the whispers of those who had gone before me, their voices filled with sorrow and regret. They were trapped, just like I was. And now, I understood. I wasn't just seeing the past. I was living it. As the snow continued to fall, the mirror's power grew stronger. It began to show me not just the past, but the future, the inevitable end that awaited me. I saw myself, years from now, an old woman, still staring into the mirror, still trapped in the same endless cycle. Time had stopped for me, and it would never start again. I tried everything to escape. I threw the mirror into the fire, smashed it against the wall, buried it in the snow, but nothing worked. Every time I thought I had gotten rid of it, the mirror would reappear. It was as if it had a mind of its own, seeking me out, pulling me back into its cold embrace. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't even leave my own home. The snow had become my prison, the mirror my warden. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just coming from the mirror, they were in my head, in my dreams, in my waking thoughts. The souls trapped inside the glass were growing restless, and I could feel their presence everywhere. They were no longer just images in the mirror. They were inside me, their cold, desperate hands reaching for my soul. And then, one night, I heard it, a voice that wasn't my own. It told me that there was only one way to free myself. To break the curse, I would have to give up everything. I would have to leave behind my life, my memories, my very soul. There was no other choice. The mirror would take me completely, or I would become one of the trapped souls, doomed to wander in the cold forever. I stood before the mirror, my reflection staring back at me. I could see the fear in my eyes, the terror of what was to come. But I knew what had to be done. The mirror had already taken so much from me. It had consumed my time, my thoughts, and now it wanted my soul. If I didn't act now, I would become just another trapped soul, another face in the endless cycle. I took a deep breath and reached out for the mirror, my hand trembling. As soon as my fingers touched the glass, I felt it, an overwhelming pull, as though the mirror was alive, feeding on my energy. The cold was unbearable, freezing me to the core. But I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I had no choice. The mirror had me now. And then, in that final moment, I saw it. The mirror wasn't just a trap, it was a gateway. A gateway to another world, a world where time no longer mattered. A world where souls could wander forever, lost in the snow, frozen in time. And as I stepped into the mirror, I knew that I would never escape. I was now a part of its cursed realm, trapped for all eternity, a lost soul wandering in the endless winter. I'm still here. I can hear the whispers, see the faces, feel the cold. Time no longer exists for me. The mirror has taken everything. I've become just another face, another soul lost in the eternal snow. I don't know how long it's been, but the cycle never ends. The mirror still shows me the past, the future, the endless loop of despair. And every time the snow falls, I know that someone else will find the mirror, just as I did. Someone else will make the same mistake. And they will join us, trapped, forever. Time will never stop for them. It will never stop for any of us. We are lost in the mirror now, forever frozen in the cold embrace of the past, unable to escape, unable to move on. And so, we wait. Waiting for the next person to fall into the trap. The snow continues to fall, and we remain. Trapped in time. Forever.